November 1967, San Francisco. Muhammad Ali was in forced exile, stripped of his title and his license for refusing to go to Vietnam. He entered the Golden Dragon in Chinatown not as a superstar, but as a man with nothing left to lose. He sat in corner booth 7, ordered tea, and studied a city map. Ali was defiantly quiet, a sharp contrast to his public persona as a loudmouth. At the same time, Raymond "Boulder" Sullivan, a 250-pound professional wrestler fueled by whiskey and aggression, stumbled into the restaurant. Sullivan was looking for a target to validate himself, and his eyes fell on the tall black man sitting with his back to the room. The cold San Francisco fog clung to the windows of the Golden Dragon, blurring the neon lights of Chinatown into smears of red and gold. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted duck and sesame oil. Muhammad Ali sat deep in the shadows of the back booth, his massive frame appearing deceptively small as he leaned over a tattered city map. He wore a plain dark jacket with the collar turned up, a stark contrast to the shimmering robes and flashing flashbulbs that had defined his life just months prior. The world knew him as a man of 1,000 words, a poet of the ring, who could predict the very second his opponents would fall. But tonight, he was a ghost. He sipped his jasmine tea with a mechanical steadiness, his eyes tracing the streets of a city that felt as foreign as the war he had refused to join. He was a king without a kingdom, stripped of his crown and barred from the only canvas where he could paint his masterpieces. The silence he maintained was heavy, a deliberate armor against a society that demanded he either fight their battles or disappear. Across the room, the heavy wooden door swung open with a violent thud, letting in a gust of damp Pacific air. Raymond Sullivan entered like a tidal wave crashing into a quiet harbor. His boots crunched on the floorboards, each step telegraphing the immense weight of a man built for the choreographed violence of the wrestling circuit. His leather coat struggled to contain shoulders that had spent years absorbing the impact of turnbuckles and concrete. Sullivan was not just drunk, he was vibrating with a toxic cocktail of cheap bourbon and the resentment of a man who felt the world was moving too fast for his kind of strength. He scanned the diners, his eyes glossing over the elderly men and the young couples until they locked onto the silhouette in booth 7. To Sullivan, the man sitting there was not a global icon. He was simply a solitary figure who did not belong, a target whose stillness felt like a personal insult to his own loud, chaotic presence. The wrestler wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and began to navigate the narrow aisle between the tables, his massive hands balled into fists as he focused his predatory gaze on the back of the unsuspecting stranger. The air in the restaurant grew cold as the distance between the two men vanished. Sullivan approached the table and began his provocation. He did not recognize Ali immediately. To him, this was just another guy who had taken his imaginary spot. The wrestler began to exert his mass, looming over the table. Ali did not stand. He continued to drink his tea, using his signature psychological weapon, total ignorance. When Sullivan turned to racial slurs and questioned the power of boxing compared to the real manly strength of wrestling, Ali slowly raised his eyes. Everyone in the restaurant went silent. 23 witnesses understood that a collision of two different worlds was about to occur. The owner of the establishment tried to intervene, but Ali stopped him with a short gesture. The giant's shadow stretched across the table, swallowing the map and the teacup in a dark silhouette of impending violence. Sullivan leaned in closer, his knuckles raking against the formica tabletop with a rhythmic, irritating thud. His breath, heavy with the sharp sting of cheap whiskey, clouded the space between them. He expected a flinch, a stuttered apology, or, at the very least, a frantic look of terror. Instead, he met a wall of absolute indifference. Ali's hands remained steady, his fingers curled around the ceramic cup with the grace of a man sitting in a quiet garden rather than a hostile dive. The air around booth 7 seemed to thicken, vibrating with the unspoken challenge. Sullivan's face grew a deeper shade of mottled crimson as the silence stretched beyond his comfort zone. He began to bark insults, his voice dropping into a low, guttural growl that bypassed the usual banter of the ring and tapped into something far more primal and ugly. He mocked the gloves, the rules, and the rhythmic dancing of the boxing ring, dismissing it all as a coward's game. He bragged about the raw, unscripted power of a man who could snap bones with a bear hug, all while his chest brushed against the edge of the table, physically encroaching on Ali's narrow sanctuary. The owner, Mr. Chen, took a tentative step forward from behind the counter, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. But Ali's hand rose just an inch, a palm flat and firm. It was a king's command, silent and absolute, signaling that the situation was under control. The witnesses watched, frozen in place, as Ali finally tilted his head back. He looked at Sullivan, not with anger, but with the detached, analytical gaze of a master craftsman observing a flawed piece of stone. The psychological trap had been set. By refusing to play the victim, Ali had forced the aggressor into a state of frantic, uncoordinated rage. Sullivan was no longer just a man looking for a fight. He was a trapped animal, blinded by his own arrogance and the terrifying realization that his size meant nothing to the man in the booth. The atmosphere was no longer that of a restaurant, but a courtroom where the sentence was about to be delivered. The wrestler's fingers twitched, his muscles coiling for a strike, yet he found himself paralyzed by the calm intensity radiating from the man who had yet to even raise his voice. Every eye in the room was fixed on the two men, waiting for the spark that would turn this heavy silence into a storm of shattered glass and broken wood. Sullivan took a final deep breath, his chest expanding to its limit, preparing to break the stillness with a force he believed was invincible. He did not realize that he was already defeated, lost in the vacuum of Ali's unshakable composure. Sullivan made the first lunge, attempting to grab Ali by the neck and simply crush him in a clinch. In that moment, time seemed to freeze for the spectators. Ali, without even assuming a classic boxing stance, utilized his phenomenal footwork even within the cramped space between the tables. He did not throw punches. He worked ahead of the curve, using his palms and elbows to redirect the giant's inertia. Every time Sullivan's hands were supposed to close on Ali's body, they found only empty air. Ali moved like a shadow. By the 8th second, Sullivan completely lost his balance due to his own weight, and Ali, with a short, almost invisible movement of his shoulder, sent 115 kilograms of muscle into a free flight. The wrestler's momentum, intended to be a terminal collision, became his own undoing as Ali stepped into the vacuum created by the giant's aggression. The air whistled as Sullivan's massive arms swiped at nothingness, his boots skidding uselessly against the floor tiles. Ali remained fluid, his center of gravity shifting with a precision that defied the chaos of the room. He was not fighting the man, he was fighting the force the man generated. With a subtle rotation of his hips and a masterful parry of Sullivan's lead arm, Ali channeled the wrestler's forward drive into a spinning trajectory. The onlookers saw only a blur of motion, a sequence of events so fast that the human eye struggled to register the lack of impact. There was no sound of a strike, only the rustle of Ali's jacket and the desperate, heavy rasp of Sullivan's breathing as he realized he was no longer in control of his own limbs. The wrestler's face, once twisted in a mask of drunken rage, now reflected a sudden, cold clarity of terror. He was airborne, his feet losing their grip on the earth as Ali's shoulder caught him at the perfect pivot point of his overextended stride. It was a demonstration of kinetic energy mastered, a silent explosion of technique that required no fist to be clenched. For a heartbeat, the 250-pound man hung suspended in the dim light of the Golden Dragon, a helpless mass of meat and bone caught in the gravitational pull of a superior intellect. Ali watched him go, his hands already returning to a relaxed posture, his eyes never leaving the falling figure. The mist of sweat and whiskey that had followed Sullivan seemed to linger in the air, a ghost of the violence that had failed to land. In exactly 11 seconds, the hierarchy of the room had been dismantled, and the myth of the wrestler's invincibility was shattered against the quiet, unyielding reality of the greatest athlete in the world. As Sullivan's center of gravity passed the point of no return, the room braced for the inevitable sound of the crash, the silence of the witnesses finally breaking under the weight of what they had just seen. Ali stood perfectly still, a calm island in the middle of a storm he had just redirected with the grace of a dancer. The wrestler collapsed onto the floor, the impact knocking the air from his lungs and nearly overturning a neighboring table. The crash was so violent that the plates rattled in the kitchen, a sharp, metallic din echoing through the stunned restaurant. Ali stood over him, but not in a victor's pose. Instead, he watched with a cold, almost surgical curiosity. He did not utter a single one of his famous punchlines. Instead, he simply waited for Sullivan to come to his senses. The wrestler, who was used to his strength deciding everything, felt absolutely helpless for the first time in his life. He realized that if Ali had wanted to, he could have ended his career in those few seconds. A dead silence hung in the room, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the fallen giant. Sullivan lay staring at the flickering fluorescent lights, his ribs aching from the sheer force of gravity that had turned his own mass against him. The floorboards beneath him seemed to vibrate with the ghost of his failure. Above him, Ali remained a motionless silhouette, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unreadable and devoid of the theatrical arrogance the public expected from him. The witnesses in the Golden Dragon watched the scene as if looking at a fallen monument. Sullivan attempted to roll onto his side, but his limbs felt heavy and uncoordinated, his nervous system still reeling from the speed of the encounter. He looked up at the man he had called a coward and saw no malice, only a profound, quiet power that made the whiskey in his blood turn to ice. The realization settled deep in his gut that all his years of training, all the scripted victories and the barroom brawls, were nothing more than child's play compared to the efficiency he had just encountered. Ali's eyes remained fixed on him, measuring his recovery with the detached patience of a man who had seen kings fall and knew the exact weight of a human spirit when it was crushed. The smell of scorched soy sauce and old tea filled the gap where the wrestler's pride used to be. Every person in the room remained frozen, afraid that even a small movement would break the heavy spell of the moment. Sullivan's fingers scraped against the floor as he finally found the strength to prop himself up on one elbow, his head hanging low in a gesture of involuntary submission. He was a man who had built his identity on being the largest thing in any room, and now he found himself dwarfed by the presence of a man who hadn't even raised a fist. The air was thick with the weight of unsaid things, the silence serving as a far more brutal critique than any insult Ali could have devised. In that stillness, the power dynamic of the Golden Dragon had shifted forever, leaving the wrestler to grapple with a new and terrifying understanding of what it truly meant to be strong. Ali simply waited, his shadow draped over the fallen man like a shroud, offering no mercy and no judgment, only the undeniable fact of his existence. Ali helped Sullivan to his feet. This was the final trigger that broke the wrestler's ego. He paid for Ali's dinner and walked out into the cold San Francisco night a different man. Years later, Sullivan would quit wrestling and begin to seek a true understanding of movement. Ali left the restaurant through the back door to avoid attracting the police. The witnesses, the old men who had been playing mahjong and the waiters, realized they had seen not a fight, but a demonstration of the superiority of spirit over matter. The legend of how the greatest defeated a mountain of muscle in a cramped Chinese restaurant remains forever within the walls of the Golden Dragon, as proof that true strength needs no publicity. The hand Ali extended was steady and warm, gripping the wrestler's massive forearm with a firm kindness that felt more devastating than any physical blow. As Sullivan stood, he brushed the dust from his knees, his movements slow and haunted by a newfound humility that made his previous bravado seem like a distant, embarrassing dream. He looked at the cashier, pulled a crumpled stack of bills from his pocket, and covered the entire tab for booth 7 without meeting anyone's eyes. The chime above the door rang out with a lonely, hollow sound as he disappeared into the swirling fog, his silhouette swallowed by the dark city streets. For Ali, the encounter was over the moment the threat had been neutralized. He moved with a quiet, feline grace toward the rear of the kitchen, nodding respectfully to the cooks who stood frozen by their bubbling woks. He vanished into the alleyway, the damp air of Chinatown cooling his skin as he walked toward a future that remained uncertain and heavy with legal battles. Back inside the Golden Dragon, the atmosphere shifted from paralyzed shock to a low, reverent murmur. The mahjong players picked up their ivory tiles, but their eyes kept drifting toward the empty booth, tracing the invisible lines of the dance they had just witnessed. They spoke in hushed Cantonese about the flow of energy and the way a man could move like water against the unyielding stone. The waiters moved to straighten the tables, their hands trembling slightly as they touched the spot where a giant had fallen. The story did not make the morning papers. There were no headlines and no cameras to capture the moment of grace. Instead, it became a secret history, passed down through the years like a sacred text among those who understood that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful. The Golden Dragon continued to serve its tea and its ginger duck, but the air in booth 7 always felt a little thinner, a little more charged, as if the echoes of those 11 seconds were trapped in the very wood and plaster. It was a victory won without a single drop of blood, a testament to a man who, even in his darkest hour of exile, remained the master of his own universe. Sullivan never returned to his old ways, trading the theater of the ring for the study of the soul, while Ali eventually reclaimed his crown, though he never spoke of the night he tamed a storm in silence. The truth remained tucked away in the shadows of Chinatown, a quiet reminder that greatness is not found in the noise of the crowd, but in the stillness of the heart when everything is on the line.